I have a couple of questions for Mr. Woodrow concerning the network security of our guest network. My first question is, was authentication to the guest network considered before the implementation of the BYOD pilot program?
It was my understanding from the procedures of the Hooksett School Board that if we have a school board member has a direct question for an administrator or a staff member, that the question needs to be directed to the superintendent, and the superintendent will determine who answers the question.
Yeah. Sure. Well, as we discussed about a month ago, when I proposed reconfiguring the meeting, we were told that the staff is here to collaborate with us so that we could get information directly from the people that know. I have no problem if we want to put that question to the superintendent, but I just thought it would make more sense for me to ask the person that likely knows the answer to that question. And particularly, I want to know if the technology director did consider it. That's why I did ask him. Thank you.
Well, I will say in the past we have had this collaboration. But at this point, we'll pass that question to the superintendent. And how would you like to respond to that?
I think that's a question.
Okay.
Can you restate the question?
Yes, I'd like to know that if the technology director considered authentication to the guest network before implementing the BYOD pilot program.
So, pre-BYOD, we consulted, talked with many districts that were doing bring your own device. And given the infrastructure that we have and what was happening in those districts that were doing bring your own device, we sort of tailored the network here to accommodate what we felt was in the best interest of the, of the students for the pilot. And then during the pilot program, we were very proactive about looking at how is that working, what are some changes that we can make. That's why we did a pilot. And then obviously, post-pilot, you take a look at what worked, what didn't work, and given the recent firmware upgrade that we can now apply to our wireless controller, it gives us a lot more flexibility and allows us to streamline processes a lot more. And so we'll be, obviously considering whether or not those would be things to implement should the pilot continue.
I appreciate that, Matt, but
Thank you.
What I'm asking is, in the planning of the BYOD pilot program, did you consider whether or not you were going to use authentication on the network?
Many different things were considered.
But again, I'm asking you.
And I answered your question.
Yeah,
I appreciate
he
that.
answered the question.
Okay, Dana, then did he consider authentication?
I believe he did.
Is that correct?
I believe I answered your question.
Well, no. I would just like to get an answer to my question.
And you did.
Consider authentication on the guest network before you implemented the program? I think it's a pretty simple question.
And again, I think the question was answered. That was what you asked me. I think the question was
Okay,
answered.
can we have the statement read back then? Well then, Matt, why don't you just save us a lot of time and just answer the question?
Well,
did you consider
again,
Because I
authentication?
did answer the
Well,
question.
yeah, he did answer the question. And again, it appears you're not happy with the answer, but
Well, Dana, it's not that I'm not happy with the answer. He said he considered many things. He did not say he considered authentication or that he did not consider authentication. And I'm not trying to be picky here. I'm just trying to get an answer to my question. Did you hear him say that he considered authentication?
well, and I don't claim to understand everything that the tech director explained, to be honest with you, but he gave you an answer to your question.
I disagree. Now, would you like me to submit the videotape of what he said at the next meeting? And would you agree that if he hasn't answered the question, we're going to get the question answered at the next meeting? Would you agree to that? Because we have it recorded right here.
Again, I'm hearing, and I heard a response to your question.
Did Did you hear an accurate response to the question that I asked?
I'm not qualified to make a decision if that was an accurate response. What I'm telling you is he responded to your question.
He said that we considered many things.
That was the second response. He had a very detailed response to the
Which
question.
none of
initially.
those details had anything to do with my question. That's not my opinion, Dana, that's the facts.
Well, again, he stated that he answered the question.
So we're going to accept that as a board.
I'm going to
All right,
accept it.
but if I submit the videotape that he has not answered that question as the chairman, will you allow this question to be heard at the next meeting and get an answer? I think that's fair. If you're saying that you heard that answer and I'm saying I didn't, and we don't have a verbatim read back, how are we supposed to
Well,
say
again,
that?
I heard a response to your question.
I could ask you any question right now, Dana, and you could respond to me. It wouldn't mean
Exactly.
you were responding to my question.
Oh, yes, it would.
If I ask you if the sky is blue and you tell me the door, that has nothing to do with my question. He did not answer my question, Dan.
Well, again, I believe he did.
Will you allow me to submit the video?
You can submit the video.
And will you
absolutely.
allow me to have that question answered if it hasn't been answered?
You can submit the video and ask me any question you like.
No, but I'd like to ask Mr. Woodrow the question. I don't
Well,
expect you
yeah.
to know it.
Well, you asked me if I would answer the question.
No, I'm asking you as the chair, if I can show you that he did not answer the question through the video, then will you allow me to ask that question again and get an answer?
I'm going to tell you that you can ask the question, and there's a response that's coming.
So I can ask the question again.
You've asked it.
And if I show you it
Several
was
times
not
now.
answered, if I show you that it was not answered, are you going to allow me to ask it again? That's a decision for the chair.
I'm going to say if you ask the same question and you get the same answer, where are we at?
I hope not to get the same answer. I hope to get a yes or no answer.
I would think you would get
It's
the
a
same
simple
answer.
question.
I would think you would get the same answer.
It's a simple question, Dan. I'll go
I-
on and
I
ask my
agree.
next question then,
I
and let's
agree.
see if I can get an answer to a different question then. My second question, let me just find my place here. Oh, Mr. Woodrow, it was clear that we had the ability to have authentication via the wireless controller before we started BYOD. And we had many lengthy conversations about different methods of authentication. Why was it that you never brought up in the discussion the whole possibility of using a wireless controller for authentication?
When we set up the wireless for the bring your own device pilot, as I had mentioned before, we had many considerations before we went into the pilot. Given the infrastructure in which we have, we were limited to what we were able to do. And I think you're still confused about encryption, authentication, and some of those terms. And so in a nice way, I'm trying to explain to you that we considered many options. And given the layout, which I think this may be the fifth or sixth time I've said this, but I'll say it again. Given the infrastructure that Hooksett has, without going into too much detail, because I feel we begin to get into some of these things that could compromise the integrity of our network. So what I'm going to say is, given the structure of the Hooksett network, we structured this in such a way that we felt would work best for the pilot program. As we went through the program, we would continue to revisit some of those things. Encryption, authentication, all of those things come into play with the wireless network. And so obviously, after the pilot, we'll go back and we'll look at different things, what worked, what didn't work. That's why you do a pilot. And we'll make changes based on that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Woodrow.
You're
Again,
welcome.
You didn't answer my question
Okay.
because my question was, in the discussions that we had, we talked about many forms of authentication that are not supported on our network currently. We were having an open discussion. We talked about MAC addresses and the fact that we would have to buy equipment to have MAC addresses. My question is, as we brought up MAC addresses, logins, and all of this other stuff, it was never brought up about doing authentication with a wireless controller, perhaps by adding VLANs, or you bringing up some possible solution although you did bring up solutions about buying Mac, addressing appliances that would be put at each school, and you were very nice to spell out a scenario of how that would happen, but we never discussed the capability that we already had with equipment that we've already purchased. And I'm just wondering why that was never brought up as a possibility.
My answer would be the same.
All right. Question asked, question answered.
I'd like to go on the record that my question was not answered. This is the second question that was not answered. I only have one more question, if you would allow me. Matt, do you currently support having authentication on the network, on the guest network?
Given the ability that we now have with the firmware that was released, it hooks it up to many different options on the wireless network without having to do a lot of changes to the infrastructure, which could be costly. One of those being streamlining the collection of MAC addresses, being able to see clients on the network, to see what kind of device they have, group those devices, take action on those devices. For example, you can isolate people onto a subnet so that they don't have access to the internal network, or completely remove access for that person. These things weren't available before that, so now that we have that ability, obviously those things will be considered in making changes.
Well, I would like to just go on the record and say that my research has shown that we had the capability with the devices that were purchased by this school district prior to BYOD to do most of what Mr. Woodrow just explained. And the firmware upgrade allows more manipulation of the data and more tracking. But the authentication piece, which is what I asked about, was there from the very beginning. Thank you.
Tricia?
And those changes that Matt is mentioning that will be looked at go through the technology committee? Like the technology committee, I'm trying to understand. The technology committee is working on the plan, like the technology plan for the next 3 years. And the administration will decide what is the best use of the current firmware with authentication and encryption.
Well, I'd like to add to that this is a security policy question that we're talking about, and I think it clearly lands here at the board to decide what policy we would like to set for security to the internet via this school's hardware and software. So I think this board should come up with some policy as to whether we are going to allow a wide open internet access here, or whether we feel that there are certain restrictions that should be instituted. I would like to do that with the support of the technical director, and I think we should, but currently it is wide open and no one is authenticating to the guest network, and we are offering access to the internet to anyone who comes into the school. Thank you.
Okay, next item.